And the result is something like this. Now, this is a house painted at Wardlow in Parkville in accordance with the National Trust colour bulletin. It's successful in the sense that it's convincing and appropriate, but you might say it's rather boring. And that's because a house of this size might well have had a more complicated scheme. It would have been worth researching it and doing it properly. But failing that, this is a sound way to treat the building. And you can see that the main colour is just what I talked about. The stucco colour is the imitation freestone, and the iron work is done in that ferric red oxide. Absolutely standard treatment.
Right. Would you, in a house like that, would you expect to see the sliding sashes be picked out in a different colour from the timber frames of the joinery? I would thought there'd be, in a house of that stage, you might get that two-tone happening.
I wouldn't guarantee that. Generally speaking, the timber joinery on these houses is grained, oak grained, not actually painted.
Right. Okay, so the house would have had graining, you reckon?
It's common. For example, in that Tasma Terrace, that Parliament Place, all the joinery was oak grained originally. Just a couple of examples at Malden which followed these guidelines. You can see the typical combinations of a cream and brown, which you expect. Here, a rather more complicated situation where the parapet original boarding with some of the signwriting is visible, then the later signwriting, which is partly destroyed, then the modern signwriting following the National Trust bulletin. That's confusing the situation, but go on here. Here's another Malden building. And you see you tend to get, right through the town, a similar range of colours, similar face of typeface and so on, and the same problem I had with the house Wardlow. You tend to get a correct, safe, but rather boring result. And you'd much rather have each building researched and restored in accordance with its own information. So, again, coming back to some of the points I've already touched on, that the colours which were available lack the purity and clarity of colours used today, that some are fugitive and are used only internally, so you have to understand that. Some are much more expensive than others. Iron oxide was used as a general paint colour, but also as a metal primer and a colour for red mortar and a wash for brick surfaces. And the colour range was vastly extended during the 19th century. I shouldn't have said here about aniline dyes. Aniline dyes, as I said before, were really used in ordinary paints. They were used for interior paints, but not for exterior paints. But the colour range was extended by various other chemicals towards the end of the 19th century. Yeah. Sorry?
When you were talking about timber work being grained,
that was outside, yes, outside, yeah. Inside as well, but outside, yes. Very common on the outside of Victorian villas here, yeah. So now, just turning to the nature of the National Trust paint bulletin, which is like a signwriting bulletin, doing the same thing for paints. It has to do with what colours were commonly used for different locations. So it discusses the three locations: the walls, the main wall body walls, the detail to say veranda, woodwork and so on, and the roof. And there are different prescriptions for each of those locations. Then you have to prescribe the colours with some degree of accuracy, which is hard to do, and I'll come back to that. And you have to be able to translate those prescriptions into modern colours. That is, the user who's told they can only paint their house cream has to be able to find out which creams you can buy over the counter, which will conform to that requirement. So those are the issues that the National Trust paint bulletin addresses. This is an early example of a house which followed the bulletin almost, but not quite. And I think you can, looking at that house, you can say it's not right. It looks too modern, too tasteful and modern. It's not a Victorian scheme. It's only by quite a small margin that those colours are outside the bulletin. When the bulletin prescribes a cream, it doesn't prescribe one cream, it prescribes a range of creams. And you might find 120 creams commercially available fit within that range. So although the National Trust bulletin only describes a small handful of colours, they are in fact each one quite a large range, especially the cream. So what you have is 10 ranges of colour, cream, brown and so on. 3 different locations, walls, joinery and signwriting and roofs. The colours are specified in terms of the Munsell system, which I'll explain in a moment. And then there was an appendix at the time of all the commercially available colours from all the companies, which of course changes all the time. But now most companies can supply you with the Munsell values so you can find out about their colours anyway. The Munsell system is one of a number of systems, and I'll just mention the CIA one first. It's a much more scientific system. There it is there, and don't ask me to explain it because I've forgotten now, once I understood it, but it's not very user-friendly for practical purposes. There's a detail of it. So each hue has this parabola, which covers the range of depth of it. But the Munsell book is designed for common use. The Munsell system was used for things like soil samples, which you could take out into the field and assess a soil sample. And it's easily the most simple system to use for paint colors. And it comes, in this case, I'm citing a 2-volume version, which has little color chips you can actually take out and put next to your paint on the wall, or put next to your paint under the microscope. So it's a very handy way to use it. And this is how it works. Now, this looks confusing at first, but this is simply an ordinary color circle. So you can see you've got the primary colors, the blue and the yellow and red, and then you've got colors in between. Now, in between, those gradations are designed to match what the eye can pick out. So they're not scientifically based, they're based on perception. And when you go around from, say, red at the top, 5 reds is the central red color, the principal red color. And you can go either direction, moving towards purple or moving towards yellow, and you get red purple or red purple, you can get red purple, then you get purple red and so on until you get around to purple. And the values, when you get to value, say you're starting at 5 at the top and you're moving around the red, you go going anti-clockwise, 5, 6, 7, etc. When you get to 10, that becomes 0 for the next color. So you're then going, 10 is the same as 0 for red purple, and you go 0 up to 5 and then up to 10 and so on. So it's a simple color circle really, such as you're quite familiar with. The middle, of course, is neutral. So the neutral, you've got a neutral gray. Now this doesn't cover everything. This is covering really the hue, actual, what you generally call loose term called the color, and the strength of the color, because as you go from the center, from neutral outwards, you're getting brighter and clearer versions of the same color. But there's another consideration, which is the amount of reflectance, the amount of light reflected from it, which is the value. So I've now put that circle near horizontal, and the value is the axis from black at the bottom to white at the top. And when you put the colors around that, like that, you find it's not a circle, it's skewed, because you can't make blues and so on very light, and you can't make the yellows and colors like that very dark. So although this is a principle like a sphere, it's not really a sphere at all, it's a skewed shape. Now I want you to consider, if you take these leaves coming out here from this model, and many more of them in between, make them all the pages of a book, you get the Munsell book, which you can use on site. And you get pages like that. So these are not the same facing pages of the book, they're 2 different pages. Near the binder, on the right of the left-hand one, on the left of the right-hand one, are the colors which are closest to the neutral axis, colors closest to the black, gray, white, and moving out to the outside, you've got the brightest colors we saw on the outside of that model. And in theory, the differences between those colors should be those that you can actually perceive with the eye. I'll give you a little test in a moment. But there's 2 of them, and you can see how close they are. Maybe you can't on the slide tell the difference, but in practice, you probably just can in practice using the colored chips. Here, I've got, just ignore the loose chips at the bottom, but looking at the main body of them, one colored chip has been misplaced. There's a detail of it. So I want you to tell me which one. Well, it's just a value of chroma off from the next page, being swapped into this page. What? I don't think you've got the right one. No, I think I better just show you. That one you meant? No. It's pretty hard to tell, I think. There's just to show you when you've got the same value and the same chroma, but different hue. So you've got 10 yellow red, 2.5 yellow, 5 yellow, 10 yellow red is not yellow. And so you can see the difference when the hue is varied. The process of paint investigation. You're seeing a star here with the conservation world is here in the audience tonight. I won't embarrass her by naming her. But coming to an actual site, it's really complicated because this is actually an American example, but look at this facade. On the right are the layers of paint that were found on it. Now, what's going to have happened here is the whole facade may have been painted in some appropriate metal sort of color. Then the pilaster, that sort of column-like thing, painted perhaps a different color. Then the panels in it painted a different color. Then the decoration painted different, and the flowers painted yellow and so on. So by the time you get to the yellow flower, you might already have 6 layers of paint, which are not different color schemes. They're all from the same original painting. And when you go up those colors on the right-hand side, maybe the first 6 or 7 are all from the original scheme. And then the next ones are the next repainting and so on. Now it requires really as much instinct as anything else to work out what belongs where. It's not just a scientific process. It involves quite a degree of art to understand what's likely. One very good way of setting things on site is this one. This is in Glasgow, but it happens to be a good example of cratering. Now, here, cutting into the modern surface with a scalpel, a medical scalpel with a curved blade, you can create this saucer-shaped depression. And ideally, you'd cut right down to the bottom into the substrate. That's the basic material, the timber and so on. In this case, it's an iron building, so it wasn't practical to cut into the iron. But when you look at that crater, you'll see right near the middle, you see the iron at the middle, then you see a sort of lighter grey colour, which is probably a zinc priming paint. Then you see a black ring, which is probably a tar, sort of preserved tar-based paint, creosote type thing. Then you see a thin layer of cream, which is possibly an original finishing colour, surprisingly thin though. Then they've repainted using the tar paint again and the cream again, but then later on, the more modern paints are thinner, and in fact, one of them you see is actually, you can see it sort of turned over a bit. That's not a good sample because you shouldn't see the edge of the paint turned over, you should see a cut. Of course, the beauty of the system is that by cutting on an angle, you've exaggerated the thickness of the layers. You can pick out the thickness because it's the vernier principle where if you cut straight through, you can hardly tell anything. But if you cut on the angle, you spread out and display the successive layers of paint. You can, in some cases, improve on this. Often the paints have deteriorated. And my experience is if they are gone chalky, which they often have, you can bring out the hue by applying oil. So you would normally apply, say, ideally apply a mineral oil, but linseed oil is perfectly good. The colours that sort of fade would suddenly become bright. It doesn't apply to the value because a chalky paint will absorb the oil and darken, but just the hue can be brought out. If you ignore the darkening effect, you can bring out the clarity of the hue by applying oil to it. Now here's, this is all a bit old-fashioned now, but this is sort of something I was doing in my day. To take a sample off the building, which is what you need to do for a microscope analysis, you take a complete chip off, again, ideally, including the substrate, some of the timber, whatever it's painted on, the timber with all the layers of paint on it. Take a bit of plastic tube, half fill it with paraffin wax, and the paraffin is the stuff you use on jams. You can still buy in supermarkets today, the stuff you use to seal homemade jam. So you have it half full, you put your chip into it, then you fill the rest of the tube up with paraffin wax, and you've got this little cylinder. When it's set, you can cut the tube off, and with a sharp blade, cut right through the middle of it, and you cut through the sample. Use a bit of fine glass paper to dust it off and get rid of all the overlaps. And you've got a very nice, clear sample to use under the microscope. You use a binocular microscope, that's one of the two eyepieces, which gives you a three-dimensional effect, which is quite important in understanding this. You'd be surprised how much using a monocular microscope you miss in interpreting these layers. And you use tungsten light, which doesn't distort the colors, and that's a light, tungsten light attached. If you are more scientific, you use one of these, which is a more modern microscope using optical fibers. And this is again, Natika who's in the audience who's doing it here. Scans digitally, and you can see there's a computer screen on the left, which you can actually see what you're looking at in some detail. Here's an example in paraffin wax. You can see how well the brightness of the paraffin wax brings out the sample while holding it in place. But there is a problem with this sample. What is it? Despite the careful cutting and sanding, that little blue bit is a folded over bit of paint. That shouldn't be there. But you can see in the sample a thick layer of sort of maybe a priming paint. So I get a better example to look at there. Here's one. Here the bottom is it's probably a cement finish, and you're getting the substrate particles, the sand, silica particles in the sand at the bottom. Then a series of layers. Now the dark layer in the middle, that sort of partial dark layer, is probably not a paint color at all. This paint is dirt, discoloration on the face of the building. And here I'd be hard put to tell what this was. You go from bottom to top, and the bottom is the substrate. You've got a thin brown layer and a thick cream layer, and I just don't know whether it means redecoration or how you would interpret that. This is where the art comes into the use of these samples. Although these are black and white, they tell you a few things. Start at the bottom left of B. There, all the dark layers are dirt discoloration, not layers of paint. If you go above that to A, near the top there's a layer with particles in it, which is a sanded finish, such as I spoke about before. Go across to the right to C, those waves are in fact brush strokes. And that's probably brushed grain to imitate timber, and you end up with that texture from the brush, which has been covered over by later paint colours that you can see in this sample. Then down at the bottom of D, there's a sort of glassy layer, and that's probably a varnish or shellac. Maybe again, it was a grain finish with a varnish on it. These are the internal paints I was talking about, fresco paints, calcimine and so on, which can be clearer colours, but tend to be pastel, faded pastel colours. That's the top part of this colour card. The bottom ones are the exterior colours. So there are these calcimine colours. Now, this is an interesting example. This is Black Rock House at Sandringham. And when we investigated this, we were puzzled to find stuck into the sort of joints of the wall some bits of sand. And we thought, well, it's near the beach. Maybe the sand's blown in and got stuck to the wall. And when you went into the veranda, again, that has had rooms built into it, and the rooms were taken out, the walls were taken out. And when you looked at the wall, you're seeing a white part of this one room, which is painted off white inside. On the right, this sort of creamy colour for the interior of another room. The black bit in the middle, dirty bit, is where the wooden partition came into the wall. And behind the wood was sand. We came to realise gradually that, in fact, that was a sanded finish on the building. The sand had been stripped off, or else when it was repainted, but in places it survived like under that partition. What clinched it for us was when we found although the weatherboards, which this has got brick ends and weatherboard sides, the weatherboards had all been stripped. Inside the wall, we found a fragment intact with the finish on it. And when we examined that piece of timber under the microscope, we found that you can see clearly the sand particles. This was a sanded finish over which paint had been put, which blinds the sand finish, but you can still see the particles in place. That was enough for us to actually gauge the size of the sand and to reinstate the original sanded finish. Here's another odd example. This is after Cyclone Tracy in Darwin, where on the courthouse, there was a strip where there had been a veranda post against the wall. So a cement wall, the veranda post had been against it, so it hadn't been repainted, but it had this reddish colour in it. The question was it a ferric oxide coloration like the examples I've shown you before, or not? Well, what it proved to be is it was never painted that colour. Darwin was a port where they unloaded iron ore, and the dust from the iron ore got in behind the column, and this was from the dust, not from a paint. And I want to conclude by just mentioning a couple of lesser known examples of special paints. When I said pre-mixed paint was not normally used, the exception is special paints for particular purposes. Paints for things like insulation, damp proofing, fungicide and so on, which often came from overseas, and even they're made locally, were pre-mixed. And this is rather surprising, I think. This is H.W. John's company in the United States, which made the first asbestos paints. Now, today we think of asbestos as being a material for that notorious asbestos cement. But when it was introduced, which is quite precisely 1868, this company suddenly introduced a range of asbestos products in 1868, mostly for roofing materials, fabric roofing materials, and for paints. And asbestos paints were very prominent, and this company's paints were on sale in Melbourne and Sydney by the 1880s. Why asbestos is particularly useful for paints, I can't make out. I'm sure it doesn't have any great effect on fireproofing the building, but it seemed to be a favoured material. And their schemes for decoration, once again, are not very exciting. This is the H.W. John's recommendation for a colour scheme. You can see how dull the colours are. And then there were, let me tell you, there were paints designed to keep a building cool, especially popular in Northern Australia. They would claim to reduce the temperature inside the building, it's painting just the roof only, by 15 degrees. The real exception was this one, Professor O'Neill, who was into global warming already. I'll give you a transcription of that so you can read it. Professor O'Neill begs to call attention to the great heat of the coming summer in consequence of Mercury's contact with the sun and Leo running into Aquarius, so that the iron roofs will certainly roast you. He is prepared to prevent these fatal consequences by using his patent composition, which is economical and adhesive, orders quick. Yes? So can we get paint samples? Oh, I think you have to go to a conservation architect. I can stick it here. There's no commercial service I know of. You have to go to an architect who handles this sort of material. And this convention, well, this fiction continues in the 20th century. Science is so far advanced now, it's not just 15 degrees, they're 30 degrees or 40 degrees lower. And how you can do that by painting the roof, I'm buggered if I know. And I conclude with this one. rather sinister example, King's Compo is designed for cooling the roofs again, but it's also promoting the White Australia policy. Mr. King is painting Australia white, and I'll finish on that unsavoury note.
Professor, I'd like to thank you for a very informative and insightful presentation. And now I don't feel so bad that I have 15 shades of colour in my lounge room, on my ceiling. Thank you very much. Please, a round of applause.